Welcome, everyone, to another edition of LawCats Live. I'm Mark Miller, the Dean here at the College of Law. Thank you for joining us. If you're interested in future LawCats Live or other events, remember to keep an eye on the law.arizona.edu site under alumni events or the master calendar. There's always a lot going on. We have a special opportunity today to join a discussion between Professor Bob Mundheim and Michele Coleman-Mays. They welcome questions along the way. If you want to ask a question, put it in the Q&A, and we can join in the conversation at any point or add them at the end as you like. And I just want everyone to know that the webinar will be recorded and posted at a future date on the website. If I did a detailed introduction of Bob Mundheim and Michele Coleman-Mays, the entire session would be taken up with their bios. These are two extraordinary friends, leaders, and colleagues. Professor Mundheim, as many of you know, is of counsel to Sherman and Sterling, and here at Arizona is professor of corporate law and finance. His bio includes time in both the private and public sector. And I think that's illustrative of many leaders in our profession. It is true for Michele Coleman-Mays as well. Among other things, Bob served as executive vice president and general counsel of Solomon, university professor of law and finance and dean at the University of Pennsylvania, which always generates a lot of sympathy for me, which I always appreciate. He was general counsel of the Treasury Department in 77 to 80, where he led a team in critical negotiations involved with freeing the American hostages in Iran, an extraordinary moment of leadership and history. Served as special counsel to the SEC and has been active in the ABA in ethics and professional responsibility and in other leadership roles throughout our profession. The formal lecture series here on corporate governance and related issues is known as the Mundheim Speaker Series, named in his honor, starting in 2011, making this its 10th year. Michele Coleman-Mays has been a speaker in that series on and off for several years. Her invitation is permanent to spend time with us either in person or online. She's been with the New York Public Library for almost 10 years as Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary. Also relevant to the current conversation, she serves as a director for GoGo Inc. Michele as well has an extraordinary background in both the private and public sphere. She began as an assistant United States attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice in Detroit and Brooklyn from 1976 through 82, leading to the role of chief of the civil division in Detroit. She then moved into the private world, first with Unisys Corporation, then moved to become senior vice president in GC for Pitney Bowes from 2003 to 2007. She's been involved in public life in various commissions, also a leader, in this case, for example, as chair of the Commission on Women in the Profession for the American Bar Association. She's known well for her work in corporate governance and is an extraordinary leader on issues of diversity and inclusion that will be part of the conversation today. With that, I turn it over to Bob and Michele to begin the conversation. They always have much to discuss, but again, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A and we'll just add them into the conversation. And again, thank you for joining us.
Michele, as I listened to Mark's introduction, one of the things that I note is that you moved up in the corporate ranks to general counsel at Pitney Bowes and then at Allstate Insurance Company. And you did that at a time when it was unusual for women or for persons of color to move up that rapidly. Why were you successful when others were not?
I suppose if I really knew the answer to that, I'd be doing something else now because I could patent it and sell it. But I honestly believe that there was a lot of luck involved in that because very frequently you don't know who's going to end up being your boss or who's going to end up in some way influencing your career. So that's why I think there was a great deal of luck. And I also think that when folks were willing to hire me, Bob, that they would have to have a certain amount of appetite for doing something that wasn't the usual thing to do. Because I wasn't what you would call the typical applicant way back some 30 something years ago. So I would say I attribute it to luck, but also to being around people that were what I would call open-minded. Of course, I worked hard.
So you're saying good luck, having a mentor or mentors,
Yeah,
building.
I didn't say that way, but because some of my managers or bosses weren't necessarily mentors, maybe they were, because we certainly didn't use that term way back then, as you well know, but they went to bat for me frequently.
And I think the other thing that you say that's really strikes a chord with me is a willingness to take risks, to do
Yes.
things that, you know, aren't in the ordinary course and that really stretch you and where you might not be able to do it, but that you're willing to say, okay, I'll take that chance.
And Bob, it's fair for me to even turn the mirror to you because when you came to this country and finally ended up at Sherman, I would say someone took a risk on you because you were an immigrant when you came to this country, a Jewish immigrant. And the legal profession wasn't necessarily hospitable. So I think both of us have had instances, and maybe they continue to thrive, unfortunately, where we're considered the other.
No, I think you're right. And certainly I came to this country in January of 1939. And you're talking about luck. I mean, we were lucky to get away. My aunt and my two cousins, who were similarly aged, they didn't make it out. And they went to a gas chamber and ended their lives early. The other thing is, as an immigrant, and that's also, I think, you may find hits a chord, is you don't know people in the right places. Actually, when we came, we didn't know anybody. And good luck intervened there that my father said to his dentist, I've got a son who's not really getting well educated in the public school in New York, in Queens. And the dentist said, well, maybe he should go to Phillips Exeter Academy, which was one of the kind of the prime places. And for some reason, I did get admitted there. And that suddenly put me in the stream of people and institutions.
Precisely. And look, I don't want to take away from what I would obviously assume you have in abundance, which is talent, but talent ain't everything. And I think too many people rely on it as though that's all that's necessary, and that's a mistake.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Well, I thought maybe we should turn a little bit to talk about some significant trends in the corporate world. There's an enormous pressure in the last few years on corporations to be sensitive to environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG. We have the Business Roundtable Statement of Corporate Purpose. Former Delaware Chief Justice Leo Strine has written a couple of articles encouraging corporations to foster ESG activity. And Jamie Dimon has written a 65-page letter to his shareholders in connection with the annual report, which basically pushes on the same lines. And it really raises the question as to whether or not corporations should turn away from shareholder primacy as the focus of corporate purpose and move to a stakeholder concept.
There has been a tremendous amount of discussion as of recent, particularly with all of the righteous protests that have ensued over the last several months, as to whether companies have really abdicated, or for that matter, been missing in action when it comes to social issues. And I think the tide is changing, because I certainly recall on many occasions when the companies for which I worked, there would have been a no comment, or that's not a sandbox we play in, unless it was more directly, very much in a linear fashion, attached to the business. And that's certainly not the case when you look at some of the issues that are fomenting in society today. I think you still go back to your question about shareholder primacy versus stakeholders. This, I think, is a false choice, Bob, and I believe you would feel the same way. I think you can have shareholder primacy that takes into account other stakeholders. I've always thought that. And when you talk about, whether or not this is a change, maybe we've just come full circle, because I think if you go back far enough, that this theme would have been in the literature. So what is it that's happened? Maybe companies have lost their way because they were so fixated on the earnings per share or what they did for the quarter. I just have to tell a funny story. When I worked at Colgate, Reuben Mark was the CEO. And Reuben was in the same class as Jack Welch at GE. And at one point, Reuben had never, and he was CEO there many, many years. He became CEO in his 40s. He didn't leave until his 60s. In any event, I remember in one of the quarters that I was there, we did not hit the earnings per share, and he lost his lunch. So he was bemoaning the fact with someone on the telephone. He said, "I can't believe this. I didn't make the quarter." And the person was listening very intently. And when there was an opportunity, finally broke in and said, "Reuben, what's a quarter?" And it almost causes you to pause a minute and realize, why am I fixating on just that measurement? So coming back, my answer to your question simply is, if you take the long-term health of the company, and I'm stressing the two words, long-term, you will and should take into account your shareholders and stakeholders.
And I think that's the American Law Institute is redrafting the principles of corporate governance into a restatement of the law of corporate governance. And that, on the purpose of the corporation, specifically takes that view that you look at the benefit to shareholders, but in doing that, you take into account the interests of employees, you take into account the interests of customers and the community and suppliers, because all of those can have an impact.
Precisely.
Another kind of way to look at that question is, we have in a number of our states constituency statutes, which basically say, you look at all these things, none of them is primary. And if you kind of think about, are those companies acting differently than Delaware companies? And Delaware is very clearly a shareholder primary. You say, the answer is no, not that you can see. Now, why do you think that is so?
Because I believe when you look at the business judgment rule, which is the holy grail when it comes to boards of directors and how they can justify the decisions they make, I think they end up taking into account many factors beyond just what the largest shareholder wants. I'm not telling you that largest shareholder doesn't carry a lot of sway. That would be foolhardy for us to think that. But I also believe that you can legitimately justify a decision that might have a short-term negative impact, meaning the share price might suffer, if you look for the long term, and that could withstand scrutiny and actually be better for the company, which is where we end up in the analysis. If it's not going to improve the value, the overall health of the company, then I think you've got a problem.
I think one thing that Delaware and let's say Pennsylvania being a good example of a constituency state, the only group that elects directors are the shareholders. So that directors also, if they think about getting reelected, if they do things for stakeholders that drive the stock price down, they may not be in their office for very long. So that if you really want a major focus on stakeholders, you may have to start thinking about, should some stakeholders have the right to elect directors? In other words, that some directors have to be representatives of stakeholders. And interestingly enough, Elizabeth Warren has introduced a statute 2 years ago saying 40% of the board ought to be elected by employees. Now, it doesn't mean you have to buy that, but certainly that's another way of looking at that issue.
That's a very complex one to unravel and probably would take up a whole nother 45 minutes, Robert. But but I know that there are institutions where employees are on the board. One of my companies where I was, we had this discussion on a panel not long ago, the CEO at Pitney Bowes. And he had an interesting observation as to whether you should have employees as representatives on the board. And he thought that in very diversified companies, it would be difficult to do that because employees very much look out for their own interests, and employees that are not aligned within the same business could be at odds with one another. That was his observation. So who is it that gets selected to be on the board? It's not an easy solution to that question.
No, I think you're right. Although there are models, the Germans have had co-determination for many, many years, and so have a number of other European countries. I want to ask you, though, about, in light of some of the voter laws that are being passed, we've had Delta and Coca-Cola take public positions on the Georgia changes. Does it make sense for companies to get involved in those kinds of issues?
I don't think they've got much of a choice. If, one of the things that talk about getting involved, if you look at the George Floyd killing from nearly a year ago now in May, most companies would have never ventured out on that limb. They would have simply said, that's for the criminal justice system, that has nothing to do with our business. But I think that stakeholders, let's go back to stakeholders and maybe even some shareholders, became outraged. And you could attribute it to the fact that the world stopped all at the same time. And for once, we were all sitting still at the same time, watching the same 9 minutes transpire where someone lost their life. But at the same time, I think the social justice issues that are roiling this country, that it's very hard to say, that's not my business. Because I think too many people would say, because companies wield so much power and have so much influence and so much money, Citizens United, that they cannot say, we stay out of politics. We stay out of social issues. I don't think employees in particular will permit you to play the role of a virgin.
Oh, Mark had said you've joined the board of GoGo. Are you going to go to the next GoGo board meeting and say GoGo's got to take a position on these political issues?
I don't think it would, first of all, it would be interesting to hear what's happening at the company first, to understand what is top of mind for the stakeholders, that is the employees in particular I'm focusing on right now. One thing, Bob, that's very much unique to Delta and American Airlines is that those are B2C companies. And that doesn't mean that that should be the only business model that determines whether you should have an interest in social issues. But it may mean that you're going to be outed much earlier, because what's interesting is that neither Delta nor, I think this is true, Home Depot, none of those companies said anything when that legislation was making its way through the legislature in Georgia. Something happened after the fact. And I would like to think that there was some pressure, I call it heat, that was applied to those companies. I don't think they just woke up and said, damn, how did that statute get passed? I think they were hoping they could stay out of the fray. And in a B2C company, I think it's much, much tougher. GoGo is a B2B. Frankly, that gives you probably a little more protection, if you will, but not 100%. I think many companies will be asked, where do you stand on this? And I wanted to finish a thought that I had started earlier. When the George Floyd killing happened, there were many companies that could have stayed quiet if you took their prior stance and said, not for us to weigh in. And they couldn't wait to do a commercial with the sad music. That ain't enough.
So Michele,
There's a question.
yeah, so we're getting questions. Some I think will come up a little later in our conversation. People starting to ask about diversity and leadership, and we'll get to those questions. But one question addresses this issue, which is, to what extent are we worried about corporate greenwashing? ESG is a pervasive discussion in corporate America and finance. We hear it, from the percent of stock managers now being directed with significant parts of portfolios, both for individuals and institutions, for example, to invest in terms of ESG. It's a conversation around the law school, but the question has to do with, is this first definitionally just too abstract? Does it lose the coherence that it might have because it's just a general vessel? And the second is, what about greenwashing? So corporations step forward and talk about the ghastly events that we've seen unfold. Is the response on Georgia voting, right? How do we sort out representing the shareholders, the larger community, the proper role, and an effort to sort of again, the question is greenwashing, just to protect the corporation against criticism, but not actually weigh in, as Bob noted, or as you noted, during the time a bill is being drafted, when they might actually shape policy on the front end.
I think so. I have there's this whole raging debate about capitalism. Has it lost its way? And is it the reason there's no middle class and that it's going to eat its own and destroy itself, to simply implode? I haven't gone there yet. And maybe I want to remain an optimist, or I'm just too brainwashed. But I do think that when you look at the issue of voter and voter suppression, I have this belief, and maybe this isn't right on point, that how do you have a healthy company if you have a society that is severely injured and sick? I don't know how to make those two coexist. Now, the reason that's a little bit optimistic and maybe rose-colored glasses is slavery lasted a damn long time before someone said, oh my God, look at this is horrendous. So I think in the long run, you need two things, and I believe they have to work in tandem. You need heat and you need light. And by that, I mean you need pressure coming from many different sources so that you can have a clear vision of what is really happening. And at the same time, you need to educate yourself. How could this affect the business? How could this affect the community in which we find ourselves really resident? We live in this community as Coke does. And that's where your board of directors sits and has those tough discussions and makes choices that may not always be clear, but that's what they're paid to do.
So one of the audience pushes on that and says, is it the board's job or management's job to articulate stances they take on social issues and connect it to shareholder value? This perspective that over time, you can align the more traditional view of private companies and their obligations to the community. Does that need to be articulated either by the board or others?
So I do think, go back to the inception of the question, which I think is a continuation, which what is ESG? It's this mashup of something. Nobody knows quite what it is. It's whatever you want it to be. Because certainly when you say social, oh my God, that encompasses so much, you go crazy. So I do think it needs to be articulated for your company, that there needs to be a way to express it that is very communal, you can communicate it in a practical way. How does this, so for a energy company, it may be fossil fuel. How are you going to deal with alternative ways of generating energy? That wouldn't necessarily be where Mars candy bars would start. So I do believe, yes, and management may take the laboring oar on it, but I don't think they should do it in a vacuum. I say this, the board is noses in, fingers out. And I think that they should sniff around and say, has this been well thought out? Have you made this accessible to anyone that they say, oh, I get why this is important? No.
I think Michelle's right. And I do think the board does have a responsibility. Now, one of the interesting things is when you decide that boards or companies should disclose what they're doing, you're now getting into the area where the SEC is interested because they're going to determine, is what you said you would do, is that really what you're doing? And the place that the SEC is looking first are to the mutual funds, which say, we are ESG friendly.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you ought to invest through us and not through another fund, which isn't. And the commission is beginning to think about what should they really disclose? What does ESG friendly mean? And then what are you really doing? And the enforcement division is getting into that discussion at the SEC table. So I think,
Bob, if that doesn't drive home, that you better be very clear on what you mean. And, did you say what you mean, and did you mean what you said? And so if you've got a disclosure, which, there's a lawsuit that was brought against Oracle, there are 3 companies, over a disclosure they made around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because someone said that it was all, a sham, and it was over disclosures.
right.
So I think it's very important to go back to Mark's point. It needs to be defined why it's important to your company in your terms.
Right. I think also when you specifically make the link, the board and the company protects itself. Because
Yes.
if you say, we're still trying to benefit shareholders at the end of the day, and this is our business judgment that we think that we ought to get out and talk about the election laws, because we think that's important for our customer base, our employee base. You may be wrong. It may turn out that the customer base hates that position that you're taking. but you can still say it was our business judgment that that was a good thing for us to do, and courts don't second guess business judgments.
I mean, the business judgment rule doesn't say you have to be right. You just better be thorough and thoughtful.
Right. Well, you started to talk about diversity and inclusion. And Michele, you've been both the chair of the American Bar Association Committee on Women in the Profession and the author of a book called Courageous Counsel, a book on women general counsels. And at the time you published that book, and that's quite a number of years ago, roughly 20% of the general counsels of the top 50 companies were women. One question, has that proportion increased? Second, there's been a increasing emphasis on women and members of minority groups in senior roles in management, in the board, and so forth. You think where we've come is good enough?
That's a softball question. So let me go back to the first part of it, which is how many women now are in the GC role in the Fortune 500. As of January 2020, that's the last time I could get my hands on any published number. It was approximately 33% of Fortune 500 GCs are held by women. So it's a definite 13% increase from the time that I wrote the book, which is 10 years ago now. So it's noticeable. But let me say this to you, and it's going to sound flippant. Maybe I mean it to be. I'll say there's been sufficient progress when we stop counting. Nobody ever counts, at least not very often, how many white males are in the job, because it's just like all of them damn near. And so when we can stop saying, oh, it's 33%, oh, it's 25%, because we go back and forth. We gain some ground and then we lose, because as people retire or move on to other positions or are promoted, whatever, you sometimes lose ground. And that's certainly been the case over that 10-year period. It hasn't stayed constant. And I don't think there's been enough progress. I'll put it to you this way. When we get to 50%, I think we can then stop counting and I'll be satisfied.
What do you think the barriers are to making the kind of progress that you feel we should be making?
There are a lot of factors, and I want to say at the outset, Bob, that I never want to have someone believe that what I've said is that women are perfect. They just need to be given the platform to show just how perfect they are. We've all got baggage and things that we need to be sensitive about, things we need to improve on, things we need to shore up, things we need to cope with and address. But having said that, I am more focused on the systemic issues rather than the individual issues that I think so often hinder progress. They're just barriers. And the one that I put at the top of the list, and this is shared not just by yours truly, is bias. That folks have the way that our brains work. You know, if you've got a functioning brain, you've got bias. It allows us to think we're being meritorious and fair and equal, but that's just not the case. As I always say, talent is evenly distributed, opportunity isn't.
So, well, okay, Mark.
So there'll be lots of questions, Michele. So you just answered one, which had to do with, or began to, diversity in upper management. People are also interested in law firms, but from the standpoint of students, they're also very interested in the pipeline and how do you begin and how do you get access to the profession, whether it's the kind of firms that ultimately lead to opportunities in-house or from moving from the law side to management side. And there's just a lot of interest in what can be done. I know I share this interest. What can the law school do? But it doesn't surprise you that our students imagine someday and would love to be on boards and in management positions and in GCs and so forth. But right now they wonder, how do I even start down that path? And they don't see the diversity in those entry points that lead to those later points.
I think you have to look harder than you really would want to. You have to work at it. But let me just talk about a program that I believe is still ongoing that I found to be extremely beneficial to high school students and some junior high, which is street law. And you don't have to be a manager or someone with a title in order to participate in that program. And I think have a lot of influence over a younger generation because it doesn't help to start working with young adults or kids when they're so far along that pipeline that it's just almost insurmountable to get the momentum that you need. And so you need to start much earlier. And I think we've done a great job with women. The pipeline is pretty robust and very full when you talk about women, not so much when you talk about people of color. And so street law to me was a fantastic model because you paired lawyers of any sort with these students, and it was over the course of a semester. We did that at Allstate. And one of the things I will tell you that I know made a difference, and I'll talk about one other program for a minute, is that when people are exposed and can see the possibilities, they go, then I can do that. You know, if you only see white males, and I love you and Bob, don't misunderstand, but if that's all you ever see, you don't think the world is hospitable to you. And so what street law did was to give these students different role models because my lawyers were women, they were minorities, some had disabilities, you name it. And we would pair them with these students during the course of the year. Let me tell you another program I have an awful lot of confidence and belief in, and that's debate. I've worked with, and again, you don't need to be even a lawyer to be a great debater. I have seen students who are involved in debate have life-changing experiences. And I think it's an area, in addition to just the law, that we should seriously invest in.
I was going to I have to laugh a little bit when you say debate is such a good thing, because the best debater in my family is our daughter, who's actually in the theater world. But, I wanted to bring up the fact that a dozen of the major US and European banks have signed an open letter describing what they thought, and these are letters signed by the general counsels.
Mhm.
So it focuses on lawyers. One, they thought that if they got together and signed a letter, that would have a lot more impact than one bank or a bunch of banks separately. It means, of course, that they can't be quite as specific and concrete because you've got to get 12 people, and this would include 2 Swiss banks, a German bank, 3 UK banks, and 2 French banks, as well as 5 US banks. But what they wanted to do was to say, here's some of the things we've got to do in order to promote leadership from women and minorities. One thing they said, the panels in the bank, which make judgments on promotions, have always got to have on them women and members of the minority. And I think that's an important point. That for every open position in the more senior ranks, where you have these panels, there've always got to be minority candidates. Don't have to have them, select them, but you're going to have a panel which has got diverse membership, and you're going to have some candidates. that are diverse, that you're going to very much support mentoring relationships so that when diverse folks come in, that they have mentors that will help guide them along the appropriate posts, and that they will have diversity and initiative training. But also, they said, we have to use our power, for example, to get law firms to do a better job of becoming more diverse. And that's going to be one of the bases on which we judge whether we will hire a law firm. And they said, it's not just the numbers, but we want to see diverse folks leading the team that's doing the work. That's very important, not just that we've got two female associates and one Black associate on the team. And that they would also be looking to try and give work to law firms which were essentially owned, had a diverse ownership. So I think these are kind of concrete things that an important employer has committed to do. And one of the advantages of this group, because this is a group that's met together for 25 years at the general counsel level, that because they've all signed on, they will look at each other and see, how are you doing? What are you doing? Tell me what kind of success you're having with this or that aspect of your program. And that, I think, can make a real difference.
I think you're right. And I'm mindful of the time. I would just point out, because I talked about bias and how it bleeds into everything we do and can really be a hindrance, big hindrance. There's a study that was done while I was chair of the Commission on Women that I would encourage folks on the call to access if you can do it. It's called You Can't Change What You Can't See. And some of the suggestions that are in Bob's letter that he quoted from are in the toolkits that accompany the research that was done under that study. It's very practical things that will address systemic bias and how you interrupt it. So I would encourage you to look for that study. You can't change what you can't see.
So, Michele, just a final question building on this, if we have time for one more question now, is about the building on Bob's question to you and your observation, which is the power of companies and their GCs working obviously with management, with the board, to shape the behavior of law firms in hiring, in promotion, and so forth. In other words, what I'm interested in, yes, that's 10 banks and it's very broad. Should more companies sign on? Are those general, is that illustrative of what we would like other private corporations and GCs to do? Are GCs broadly talking about their ability? Because I think it's fair to say that in-house counsel have been a leader, not a follower, in terms of diversifying the profession. And the question is, what is appropriate leverage on law firms and legal service providers?
Well, I could talk about this one for another half hour at least, so let me try to be somewhat succinct. There was a study done by the same commission that I referenced earlier, the Commission on Women, called The Power of the Purse. And it was imploring general counsel, this is done 10 years ago, Mark, to understand how much influence, if I could use a charitable word, because they decide which law firms to hire. And that if they understood the way in which they could wield that money, that influence, that power, they could start to have very clear outcomes that were different than the ones we have been experiencing for decades. It's been a mixed outcome on this. Again, this started many, many decades ago. Even before the Power of the Purse study, there was a call to action by Rick Palmore, which was done right around the time I became general counsel at Pitney Bowes. So we're going back a ways. So there have been statements signed. Come back to transparency. Show me what you have done. Don't tell me what you hope you will do. I think it has to be very concrete steps that are taken because none of this happens overnight. That's the other problem. You want to take an Excedrin and wake up in the morning and have your headache gone. This takes stick-to-itness. And there will be setbacks before you make progress, but you have to be deliberate and dedicated to it. Let me tell you one small thing I think people can do when you talk about sending messages about how much you are open and inclusive. How do you run meetings? And I know that sounds so trite, but for companies, that's where we spend most of our lives would be in meetings. That was a rude awakening I had when I joined my first company. I thought, when do they make money? They just meet. But the question that I would ask is, who's invited? Who speaks? Who gets interrupted? Who sits where? That's a big deal. And everybody who's running a meeting can take note of that and start making systemic changes. It's a small step, but I think it's concrete. I'm into concrete steps, not in signing letters or waving flags or putting an ad on air.
Yeah, great. Well, so this has been extraordinary. And of course, these are profound issues. And you've just made that point that not only there need to be concrete steps, but that we have to take a long view. And part of our discussion here has been about the transformation of both business governance and legal practice. A number of the questions that came in about, will banks themselves be transparent? Will they judge themselves on the standards that they now, this group of banks impose on firms? But this has been, as always, immensely revealing. And Michele, we know your schedule. None of us are spending much time on planes, but it doesn't mean our schedules aren't more than full. And to have this chance to hear from you and talk with Bob today has really been a treat. So thank you both.
So could I just end with one quote that I love from Roxane Gay, who wrote The Bad Feminists? She said, "I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm not trying to say I have all the answers. I'm not trying to say I'm right. I'm just trying to support what I believe in, trying to do some good in this world." Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and the great questions, which have, as always, been to the point and helped the conversation along. And again, Michele, we look forward to a time when we can have you back in Tucson in person to continue this conversation. All of the issues, both the issues of governance that you've engaged with Bob and others on for years, and the issues of leadership and diversity and inclusion are very important to our community. And so we appreciate your helping us, bringing a little light to the subject and taking your time to engage with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.